The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when the Chen family arrived at the bustling international terminal. Little did they know their dream vacation to Hawaii would take an unexpected turn that would change not just their lives, but the lives of countless other travelers. "Did you triple-check the tickets?" Mrs. Chen asked, adjusting her daughter Emmy's backpack strap. Her husband nodded, patting his jacket pocket where he kept all their documents meticulously organized. Their son Kevin trudged behind them, pushing the cart loaded with their carefully packed suitcases. They had planned this trip for months. Dr. Chen had finally managed to take 2 weeks off from his demanding schedule at the hospital. Between his surgeries and Mrs. Chen's marketing agency deadlines, finding time for a family vacation felt like solving a complex puzzle. But here they were, 3 hours early for their flight, just as the airline had recommended. The first sign of trouble came at the check-in counter. The young woman behind the desk kept glancing at her computer screen, then back at their tickets, her forehead creasing with each look. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding particularly sorry at all, "but it seems we're overbooked today." Mrs. Chen blinked in surprise. "But we confirmed our reservations last week. We even called to make sure everything was in order." "Yes, well, these things happen," the staff member replied, her tone dismissive. "You should have arrived earlier." She barely looked up from her screen as she spoke. Kevin, their tech-savvy 16-year-old, stepped forward. "Mom, we got here 3 hours early. How much earlier did they want us to come?" Around them, the terminal was filling up with other families. A couple with small children was led to the counter next to them, and within minutes they were checked in and headed to security. Dr. Chen watched silently, his expression thoughtful as he observed similar scenes playing out across the terminal. "Perhaps there's been a mistake," Dr. Chen said quietly, pulling up their confirmation emails on his phone. "Our reservations were confirmed, and we paid for specific seat assignments." The staff member sighed loudly, as if they were being difficult on purpose. "Sir, as I explained, the flight is overbooked. We can try to get you on tomorrow's flight, but there are no guarantees." Emmy, their 12-year-old daughter, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, what about our hotel booking? And the surf lessons we scheduled?" Mrs. Chen felt her heart sink. They had spent hours researching and booking activities, carefully planning each day to make the most of their precious family time. Now it was all falling apart at the check-in counter. As they stepped aside to let other passengers through, they noticed a pattern emerging. Certain families were sailing through check-in, while others were being told the same story about overbooking. Dr. Chen pulled out his phone and began quietly documenting what he observed, his years of medical training kicking in as he noted details with clinical precision. "This isn't fair," Kevin whispered, watching another family get bumped from the flight. "They can't just do this to people." Mrs. Chen squeezed her son's shoulder, her marketing expert's mind already whirring with possibilities. She pulled out her own phone and started making notes, occasionally exchanging knowing looks with her husband. The morning stretched on, their carefully planned itinerary slipping away with each passing hour. Other families around them grew increasingly frustrated, voices raised in anger and desperation. But the Chens remained surprisingly calm, which seemed to unsettle the airline staff more than any amount of shouting would have. "Should we yell too?" Emmy asked, watching a man at the next counter wave his arms in frustration. "Everyone else is." Her father shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes," he said, pulling out his laptop, "the quietest response can be the most powerful." The airline staff kept glancing nervously in their direction, clearly waiting for the inevitable explosion of anger. But the Chens simply sat down in the waiting area, their devices out, occasionally talking quietly among themselves and with other stranded passengers. Little did anyone know that this moment of apparent defeat would spark a movement that would transform the way airlines treated their passengers. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the Chen family's unexpected response to this injustice was already taking shape, though none of the harried airline staff could have guessed what was coming. Instead of a vacation, they were about to embark on a different kind of journey, one that would leave everyone, from airline executives to fellow travelers, completely stunned. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal buzzed overhead as Dr. Chen quietly opened his laptop. The customer service staff watched him nervously, expecting another angry tirade like the ones they'd been dealing with all day. Instead, the sound of gentle typing filled the air. "What are you working on, Dad?" Emmy asked, peering over his shoulder. Her father had that focused look she usually only saw when he was preparing for a difficult surgery. "Remember how we helped fix Uncle Bob's restaurant last year?" He replied, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to understand it from all sides. Mrs. Chen sat nearby, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke softly into it. The slight smile on her face seemed out of place given their situation, but those who knew her recognized that expression. It was the same look she wore when planning her most successful marketing campaigns. "Yes, I understand," she said into the phone, jotting notes in her small notebook. "And how long have you been working in the airline industry? 20 years? That's fascinating. Could you tell me more about how the booking systems have changed since you started?" Kevin had stopped sulking about their ruined vacation and was now watching his parents with growing interest. Other stranded passengers noticed too. The angry shouts that had filled the terminal earlier were giving way to curious whispers. "Mom," Kevin said, sliding into the seat next to her after she finished her call. "That's the third airline industry person you've talked to. Are you doing what I think you're doing?" His mother's eyes twinkled. "What do you think I'm doing?" "You're not just gathering complaints," he said slowly. "You're building a complete picture, like when you helped that struggling coffee shop understand why they were losing customers." A nearby passenger, who had been listening in, leaned forward. "Sorry to interrupt, but what exactly are you folks planning? We've all been yelling and threatening to sue, but you're so calm." Dr. Chen looked up from his laptop with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places. My wife and I have learned that lasting change rarely comes from anger alone." As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable began to happen. The atmosphere in the terminal started to shift. Passengers who had been red-faced with anger earlier were now sitting with their own laptops and phones out, following the Chen's lead. Amy watched in amazement as her mother moved from group to group, her natural warmth drawing people in. "It's like when we had that block party," she whispered to Kevin. "Mom made everyone feel like they were part of something bigger." The airline staff didn't quite know what to make of it. They were trained to handle angry customers, but this quiet, organized response was something entirely new. Some of them even began to discreetly share their own insights when Mrs. Chen asked just the right questions. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said softly, turning his laptop screen toward his wife. He had created a detailed flowchart showing the airline's booking and bumping procedures, complete with suggestions for improvement at each step. Mrs. Chen nodded appreciatively. "And look at what I've found," she replied, showing him her notes. She had gathered insights from current and former airline employees, industry experts, and even a few aviation journalists she'd managed to contact. Kevin, who had been working on his own project, spoke up. "I've been checking social media. You won't believe how many similar stories I've found. But no one's ever tried to fix the problem like this before." A small crowd had gathered around the Chen family, drawn by their unusual approach. Instead of demanding immediate solutions, they were building something much more powerful, a bridge between frustrated passengers and a broken system. "Could you explain what you found about the booking algorithms?" asked one passenger, a software engineer who had been bumped from his flight. "I might have some insights to add." As the sun began to set outside the terminal windows, the scene inside had transformed. What had started as a terrible day was turning into something unexpected, a movement born not from anger, but from understanding and collaboration. "I think we're going to need a bigger spreadsheet," Amy giggled, watching as more and more passengers contributed their experiences and expertise. Dr. Chen smiled at his daughter. "You know what, sweetie? I think we're going to need much more than that. We're going to need everyone's help to make this work." The airline staff, who had been bracing for a day of confrontations, found themselves watching in confusion as their terminal turned into what looked more like a peaceful think tank. The Chen family had turned their misfortune into an opportunity, and they were bringing everyone along with them. As night fell, Mrs. Chen made one final call. "Yes," she said into her phone, that familiar smile still playing on her lips. "I think we're ready for phase 2. And trust me, no one's going to see this coming." The airport hotel room had become their temporary command center. Laptops, tablets, and notebooks covered every available surface as the Chen family worked quietly but purposefully. Outside their window, planes took off and landed, a constant reminder of their interrupted vacation plans. "Dad, look at these numbers," Kevin said, pointing to his screen. He'd spent the last 3 days analyzing the data they'd gathered. "It's not just our flight. This has been happening for months." Dr. Chen nodded, looking up from his own work. The cardiac surgeon's methodical approach to problem-solving was proving invaluable. Your mother's contacts in the industry confirmed it, but numbers alone won't tell the whole story. Mrs. Chen sat cross-legged on one of the beds, her marketing expertise showing as she organized video testimonials from affected passengers. "These stories are powerful," she said, reviewing a clip from an elderly couple who'd missed their granddaughter's wedding. "But we need to present them the right way." Emmy, who'd been unusually quiet, suddenly perked up. "It's like that science project about water pollution, isn't it? When we showed both the problem and the solution, people actually listened." Her mother beamed. "Exactly, sweetie. That's why we're not just collecting complaints. We're building a complete picture." The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the clicking of keyboards and occasional rustling of papers. Their hotel stay, though expensive, was giving them something priceless: time to transform their frustration into action. A knock at the door made them all look up. It was one of the flight attendants they'd met earlier, stopping by after her shift. "I brought those internal policy documents you asked about," she said quietly. "And there are others who want to help too." Over the past week, something remarkable had happened. Word had spread through the airport community about the family who responded to injustice not with anger, but with careful documentation and analysis. Airline staff, ground crew, and even some managers had begun sharing information discreetly. "Look at this," Kevin said, pulling up a new spreadsheet. "When you combine the staff insights with passenger experiences, you can see exactly where the system breaks down." Dr. Chen smiled at his son's enthusiasm. The teenager who'd been mortified by the situation a week ago was now fully invested in finding a solution. "And what patterns do you see?" "It's not just about overbooking," Kevin explained, pointing to his analysis. "It's about communication, training, and outdated systems. But the best part is, all of these things can be fixed." Mrs. Chen was on her tablet, reviewing the draft of their report. "The key is presenting this in a way that encourages cooperation rather than confrontation," she mused. "We want to build bridges, not burn them." Emmy had taken charge of organizing the video testimonials, her young mind picking up on details adults might miss. "Mom, I noticed something. When people tell their stories, they don't just want compensation. They want to know it won't happen to someone else." The family worked late into the night, their hotel room illuminated by screen glows and desk lamps. They turned their misfortune into an opportunity, but more than that, they'd created a movement. "Remember the butterfly effect we learned about in school?" Emmy asked, yawning as she helped sort through more testimonials. "How one small change can create big results. Are we making a butterfly effect?" Her father paused his typing, looking thoughtfully at his family. "I think we're creating something even more powerful. We're showing that change doesn't always have to come from conflict." Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed with another message. More people wanting to share their stories, more industry insiders offering information. "The airline executives are probably expecting angry letters and lawsuits," she said with a slight smile. "They have no idea what's coming." Kevin looked up from his laptop. "Will they even listen to all this?" "They'll have to," his mother replied confidently. "Because we're not just showing them what's wrong, we're showing them how to fix it, and we're not alone anymore." As the week drew to a close, their detailed report was taking final shape. It wasn't just a complaint or an exposé, it was a roadmap for change, built from the combined wisdom of passengers, staff, and industry experts. "I think we've created something special here," Dr. Chen said, looking at their work spread across the room. "Sometimes the quietest responses can make the loudest impact." Anna yawned again, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "Do you think other kids will learn about this someday? About how being calm and smart is better than being angry?" Her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I think they'll learn something even more important, that one family can make a difference when they choose to respond to unfairness with understanding instead of anger." Outside their window, another plane took off into the night sky. Their vacation plans had been derailed, but they'd found something more valuable, a chance to create lasting change. And they were about to show the world that sometimes the most powerful response is the one nobody expects. 2 weeks after their airport ordeal, the Chen family's living room had transformed into something that looked like a mix between a classroom and a community center. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and a projector displayed a presentation titled "Know Your Rights as an Air Traveler." "Is everyone comfortable?" Mrs. Chen asked, offering water to the dozen people gathered in their home. These weren't just angry passengers anymore. They were members of their newly formed traveler advocacy group. Dr. Chen stood at the front of the room, his surgical precision now focused on explaining passenger rights. "The key isn't just knowing your rights," he said, clicking to the next slide. "It's understanding how to assert them effectively." A young mother raised her hand, balancing a sleeping toddler on her lap. "But what if they still try to bump us from our flight, like they did last month?" Kevin, who had been helping set up the presentation equipment, stepped forward with his tablet. "That's why we created this app," he said, his voice confident. "It helps you document everything in real time and connects you with others in similar situations." The room buzzed with interest as Kevin demonstrated the simple app he'd designed with help from some tech-savvy volunteers. It was basic but effective, just like their approach to solving this problem. "Remember," Amy chimed in from where she was handing out information packets, "it's not about fighting. It's about working together to make things better." Her parents beamed with pride at how well she'd grasped the heart of their mission. Mrs. Chen moved to the front of the room, her marketing expertise shining through in the way she engaged with their guests. "We've partnered with travel rights organizations in 5 different languages now," she explained. "Because everyone deserves to understand their rights, no matter what language they speak." The workshop continued with practical role-playing exercises. People took turns practicing calm responses to common airline issues. Laughter filled the room as they acted out scenarios, replacing fear and frustration with knowledge and confidence. "Last month, I would have just gotten angry," one elderly gentleman admitted during a break. "But now I feel prepared, empowered." That word, empowered, was exactly what the Chen family had hoped to hear. They weren't just helping people avoid bad situations, they were teaching them how to be part of the solution. Amy had set up a small refreshment table with cookies she'd baked herself. "Mom," she whispered, watching people chat and share stories over cookies, "this feels like when we helped put together the school carnival. Everyone's working together." Her mother nodded, smiling as she watched their living room full of engaged community members. "That's exactly right, sweetie. Change happens when people come together." Dr. Chen was in deep conversation with a civil rights lawyer who had volunteered her services. "These workshops are just the beginning," he explained. "We're creating a network of support that extends beyond just air travel." Kevin had gathered a small crowd around his laptop, showing them updates to the tracking system he'd developed. "See, when you input your experience, it adds to our database. We can spot patterns and predict where problems might occur." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as more people arrived for the second session of the day. They'd had to start offering multiple workshops to keep up with demand. "Look at this message," Mrs. Chen said, showing her husband her phone. Another airline passenger group from across the country wanted to start similar workshops in their city. A retired teacher raised her hand during the Q&A session. "But how do we keep this going? How do we make sure this movement doesn't lose momentum?" Dr. Chen smiled, looking around at the room full of engaged faces. "That's the beauty of this approach. We're not just fighting one battle, we're building a community, and communities support each other." Amy had been collecting feedback cards from participants. "Dad," she said excitedly, "someone wrote that they used our techniques last week and the airline actually listened to them." The workshop wrapped up as evening approached, but the energy in the room remained high. People exchanged contact information, made plans to attend future sessions, and shared their own stories of using their new knowledge. Next week, Mrs. Chen announced, "We'll have special guests from the Passenger Rights Association joining us. And thanks to everyone's support, we're now offering these workshops completely free." As the last participants left, the family gathered in their kitchen, tired but satisfied. The smell of Amy's cookies still lingered in the air. Kevin said, closing his laptop, when we got bumped from that flight, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. But look at what we've created instead. Dr. Chen put his arm around his wife's shoulders. Sometimes the best journeys aren't the ones we planned, he said softly. They're the ones that find us when we're busy making other plans. Outside, the sun was setting on another successful workshop day. But for the Chen family and their growing community of advocates, this was just the beginning of something much bigger than themselves. The airline's corporate headquarters buzzed with unusual energy that morning. The boardroom, usually filled with routine discussions about profit margins and fuel costs, was about to receive something unexpected. Another complaint package? The CEO asked, accepting the thick envelope from his assistant. He'd been dealing with angry letters for decades, but as he opened this one, his expression changed from routine annoyance to genuine surprise. Inside wasn't a lawsuit threat or angry demand letter. Instead, he found a meticulously prepared proposal, complete with charts, data analysis, and something that made him sit up straighter: solutions. Meanwhile, the Chen family was having breakfast at their kitchen table, calmly eating toast and checking their phones. "Has anyone looked at their email yet?" Mrs. Chen asked, hiding a smile behind her coffee cup. Kevin glanced at his phone and grinned. "The tracking system shows they opened our package 10 minutes ago. Want to bet they're not getting much other work done this morning." Back at the airline headquarters, the CEO had called an emergency meeting. The boardroom table was now covered with spread-out pages from the Chen family's proposal. Department heads leaned forward, pointing at different sections with growing interest. "Look at these customer service improvements," the operations director said, tapping a detailed flowchart. "They're not just complaining, they've actually figured out how to save us money while improving service." The human resources director nodded enthusiastically. "And these staff training suggestions, they've somehow gotten input from our own employees. But not in a negative way, it's all constructive." In their kitchen, Amy helped clear the breakfast dishes. "Do you think they'll actually read everything we sent them?" she asked, worried about all their hard work going to waste. Dr. Chen smiled at his daughter. "Remember how your science fair project got the principal's attention? Sometimes, when you do something unexpected, people can't help but pay attention." The proposal wasn't just about problems, it was filled with practical solutions. Cost-benefit analyses showed how treating passengers better would actually improve the airline's bottom line. Real stories from passengers were paired with specific suggestions for improvement. This section on booking systems, the airline's IT director mused, scanning the pages. "They've identified inefficiencies we've been struggling with for years. And their solutions, they're actually doable." The airline's legal team sat quietly in the corner, looking slightly lost. They'd prepared for damage control, for lawsuits and media threats. Instead, they were watching their colleagues get excited about making real changes. Back home, Kevin was updating their community website. "Mom, look at these messages coming in. Other passengers are sharing how they're using our approach with different airlines too." Mrs. Chen nodded proudly. "That's exactly what we hoped would happen. Change doesn't have to start at the top. Sometimes it starts with one family deciding to do things differently." In the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted from defensive to energized. The CEO stood at the head of the table, looking at his management team's eager faces. "In 30 years of airline management," he said slowly, "I've never seen anything like this. They're not asking for money. They're not demanding heads roll. They're showing us how to be better." Emmy's phone buzzed with a message from one of their workshop participants. "Dad, the lady with the 2 kids we helped last week, she just got a proper response from the airline about her complaint. She used our method." Dr. Chen shared a knowing look with his wife. Their approach was working, not just with one airline, but across the industry. Their quiet revolution was spreading. The airline's customer service director was practically bouncing in her seat. "We can implement some of these changes immediately," she said, flipping through the proposal. "And look, they've even included training materials we can use." By lunchtime, the airline's PR team had scrapped their prepared defensive statements. Instead, they were drafting something very different: a thank you letter and an invitation to meet. "They want to talk to us," Mrs. Chen announced, reading the email that had just arrived. "But not just us, they want to meet with our whole community group." Kevin looked up from his laptop. Should we be surprised? We didn't just complain, we gave them a path forward. The afternoon sun streamed through their window as the family gathered in their living room, reading the airline's response together. Their approach had done more than get attention, it had sparked genuine change. You know what this reminds me of? Amy said thoughtfully. It's like when we had that big problem with the school lunch program. Instead of just complaining, we showed them how to fix it. Dr. Chen nodded proudly. Sometimes the best way to change a system is to show it a better way to work. Not through force, but through understanding and cooperation. As evening approached, the airline's CEO sat in his office, still looking through the proposal. On his desk, a new memo was ready to go out to all staff. Its title read, "A New Approach to Passenger Care, Learning from Our Customers." The Chen family's unexpected response had done more than solve a problem. It had shown an entire industry that there was a better way forward. And this was just the beginning. 6 months had passed since that fateful day at the airport. The Chen family stood in the same terminal where their story began, but everything felt different now. They weren't here for a flight. They were here to see their work in action. "Look, Mom." Annie pointed excitedly at the new information kiosk they'd helped design. "They're actually using our passenger rights guide." The colorful display showed clear, simple instructions in multiple languages, helping travelers understand their rights and options. Dr. Chen watched as airline staff handled an overbooked flight situation. Instead of the chaos they'd witnessed months ago, there was a clear, fair process in place. The staff seemed more confident, the passengers less anxious. "The numbers don't lie," Kevin said, checking the latest data on his tablet. Overbooking complaints are down by 50%, and when issues do happen, they're resolved 3 times faster than before. Mrs. Chen smiled as she recognized one of the customer service agents. She'd attended their workshop last month. The agent was calmly explaining options to a family, using the very techniques they'd helped develop. "You know what makes me proudest?" Dr. Chen said, watching the scene. "It's not just this airline. Other companies are starting to follow their lead." He was right. Their approach had created ripples throughout the industry. Airlines across the country were implementing similar changes, reaching out to their community group for guidance and support. Amy tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Remember when I was so embarrassed about what happened? Now my friends at school think it's the coolest thing ever. My teacher even asked me to talk about it in class." The teenagers who had once rolled their eyes at their parents' methodical approach were now leading their own initiatives. Kevin had started a club at his high school, teaching other students how to turn problems into opportunities for positive change. Yesterday's meeting was interesting, Mrs. Chen mentioned as they walked through the terminal. She'd been invited to speak at an airline industry conference, not as a critic, but as a partner in improving customer experience. A group of flight attendants waved as they passed. The staff had become some of their biggest supporters, thankful for changes that made their jobs easier and more satisfying. "The new system helps everyone," one had told them. "Happy passengers make for happy crews." Dr. Chen paused at the spot where he'd first started documenting their experience. "Remember how quiet we were that day?" he asked his family. "Everyone thought we were giving up, but we were actually starting something bigger." The airport's general manager approached them, smiling warmly. "The new training program you helped develop goes nationwide next month," she shared excitedly. "Other airports are already asking to adopt it." Kevin pulled up some recent feedback on his phone. "Look at this message from a grandmother in Texas. She used our app to help her whole senior citizens group understand their travel rights. They're starting their own workshop program." The family's initiative had grown beyond anything they'd imagined. Their workshop materials had been translated into 12 languages, their app had users across the globe, and their approach was being taught in business schools as a case study in effective advocacy. "My favorite part," Amy said, watching a young family navigate the check-in process smoothly, "is that people aren't so scared of flying anymore. They know their rights, and they know someone's looking out for them." Mrs. Chen checked her calendar on her phone. "The student group from the high school is coming to our workshop next week. They want to learn how to tackle problems in their own community." "That's the real success," Dr. Chen said proudly. "We didn't just fix one problem, we showed people a new way to solve their own." A flight delay announcement came over the speakers, but instead of the usual groans, passengers calmly checked their phones. The airline's new transparency system, inspired by the Chen family's suggestions, kept everyone informed and offered clear solutions. 6 months ago, that announcement would have caused chaos, Kevin observed. Now look, everyone knows exactly what to do. As they walked through the terminal one last time, they'd passed the spot where they'd spent that long, frustrating day. A small plaque on the wall caught Emmy's eye. It read, "Sometimes the quietest voices create the loudest change." "Did you know they were putting that up?" she asked her parents. Both shook their heads, equally surprised and touched. Mrs. Chen gathered her family close. "You know what this proves? That one family really can make a difference when they choose to respond to unfairness with understanding instead of anger." As they headed home, the terminal behind them hummed with the sound of progress, passengers being treated with respect, staff working with confidence, and problems being solved before they could escalate. "So," Dr. Chen asked with a twinkle in his eye, "should we start planning that Hawaii vacation again?" They all laughed, but they knew that what they'd achieved was worth far more than any vacation. They'd shown the world that positive change doesn't always come from loud voices or angry demands. Sometimes it comes from a family who decides to respond to a problem with patience, understanding, and a determination to make things better for everyone. The sun set behind the airport, painting the sky in beautiful colors. As planes took off and landed, carrying thousands of passengers who would never know their names, the Chen family had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not a shout, but a whisper that starts a revolution of kindness.